article was triggered by this report, as you rightly say, a report on affirmative action for Muslims. But this particular report happens to answer a question that I have been asking for the last 20 years. And frankly, I've not had very good answers. The question is, how do you address Muslim disadvantage?
There's also this argument amongst Muslims that all this talk about, yes, there are backward Muslims, there are untouchables amongst Muslims, etc. This is all right-wing propaganda to sow divisions because the scriptures don't have castes.
Actually, no, it's optimism. It's optimism because I do believe that certain things should be kept in the drawer. Because I do believe a time will come when there would be political space to addressing these issues, and times when you think, "Arey, ab kya hoga? Is waqt kaun sunega?" That's exactly the time for someone to sit down and draw a very careful blueprint.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Deshkaal with Yogendra Yadav. Actually, the topic today is something that is of great relevance, especially considering the recent caste survey tabled by the Telangana government. And there is now a lot of conversation about backward Muslims and reservation for them. I believe a union minister has commented on why the union government will not accept inclusion of Muslims, I think, in the backward class. Like, I believe there is a proposal to raise the limit of reservation in Telangana. But this is, of course, just one state. And Yogendraji, when you wrote your article for us this week, you began with this report which has just been released about rethinking affirmative action for Muslims. So tell us, what is the significance of this report?
Thanks, Pooja. The article was triggered by this report, as you rightly say, a report on affirmative action for Muslims. But this particular report happens to answer a question that I have been asking for the last 20 years. And frankly, I've not had very good answers. The question is, how do you address Muslim disadvantage? Now, mind you, this is different from the question of discrimination, different from what happens in riots, different from what happens on everyday basis. And lynching, bulldozer, all that's a different question altogether. Muslims also happen to be seriously disadvantaged in terms of education, economic situation, and so on. How do we address that is a question that has been in my mind. And there have been two standard answers. One is, well, you don't need to really do anything substantial, uplift the entire country, everyone gets lifted, and so on. Because there is a bit of an anti-reservation sentiment, especially in the somewhat educated upper caste people. There's general anti-reservation sentiment. And of course, needless to say, there's anti-Muslim sentiment. So that gets fused, and the idea is, oh my God, reservation for Muslims, how can you even think of things of this kind? On the other hand, those who recognize and see that, look, Muslims suffer from serious disadvantage, many of them have over the years taken a position to say, okay, if OBCs can get reservation, if SC and ST get reservation, Muslim situation is not very different. Why can't we think of reservation for them as well? This has been articulated by the National Minorities Commission. This is a position taken by some community leaders as well. And I've been uneasy with both these ways of responding to this. And I have been groping for a way to accept two things simultaneously. One, that the situation that Muslims face require a policy response. Some kind of affirmative action is required. Two, however, reservation is not what would work. When I say reservation won't work, I mean, like you have SC, ST, OBC, introducing one more category called Muslims and reservation for them. It won't work, and there are three simple reasons why it won't work. One, because legally, constitutionally, this is not going to pass the muster of judiciary. Our constitution does not provide for religious categorization. Number two, sociologically, this would not be good because Muslims do not constitute one category. When it comes to religious discrimination, yes, they are one. But when you look at their educational and economic condition, there's a huge difference because there are jatis and biradris among Muslims. And just like Hindus, some are right at the top, some are right at the bottom. although the average happens to be lower than the rest of society. So sociologically, it's not quite appropriate to say that all Muslims constitute one single bloc. And third, politically, this is just an invitation to an all India mobilization in a present political context to have a national debate on reservation for Muslims. Is only an invitation to further mobilization and ostracization of the community, which is the last thing that Muslims need. So, what is the way out? And what attracted me about this report was that it suggests a sensible frame to think about it question. Sensible frame that goes beyond. And incidentally, the report is available on the net free. You can read it. There's a link. It suggests a frame that I like very much. So what they are saying essentially is something like this. They say, do not think of reservations for Muslims. However, within the existing reservations for SC, ST, OBC, tweak it slightly so that Muslims also get the due share. How can that be done? In 3 steps. Number one, large number of Muslims communities deserve to be in OBC, but for various administrative and political reasons, they have not been given the OBC status. So put them in the OBC not as Muslims, but as specific communities, just as it has been recently done in Bengal, has been done in Telangana, Andhra, different places. So not merely as Muslims, but simply because they happen to be, someone happens to be Darji, someone happens to be Bunkar, someone comes from a Mochi community, and so on and so forth. So give them that status. Second, within the OBC, think of an upper and a lower OBC, a categorization that exists in various states, but does not exist at the central level. And in the important point that report makes is, within OBC, do not create a separate category for Muslim OBCs, which is what you actually have in Kerala right now. You have that categorization in Karnataka. You have that in Telangana as well. In many states, you have that categorization. The report says you don't need to do that. Simply divide the OBCs into OBCs which are backward and OBCs which are extremely backward. Some Muslim communities will go in the upper one, some Muslim communities will go in the lower one. So it's a religion agnostic approach. And third, they say, within the scheduled caste category, if there are Muslim communities who have been untouchables in the past and who are practically still treated as untouchables today, but they happen to be Muslim, please allow them to be scheduled caste because that's what they are. Unfortunately, a certain interpretation or a certain constitutional order prohibits it. Many readers may not know it, but if you are a Muslim or a Christian, you can be scheduled tribe, but you cannot be scheduled caste. Yes. Even if you come from a scavenging community, you do exactly what the Valmikis do. You are a Safai Karamchari, you are treated exactly like that. But because you happen to be Muslim, you cannot be given the benefit of scheduled caste. So the report says, please remove this barrier. It should be religion agnostic. So one part of the suggestion is about tweaking the existing reservation system. The second part is do things other than reservation as well. Namely, there is a territorial spatial approach, which is to say, focus on those areas, not just district, but blocks, villages, localities, which have concentration of Muslim population, and work for the upliftment of that area in general, not just for one community. Second, there are certain sectors of economy which happen to be dominated by Muslims and where workers are doing very poorly currently. Lock making, utensils making, glassware, Banarsi sari, carpet weaving, perfume industry, dominated by Muslims. Conditions of the workers is very poor. So just lift these industries, support these industries, these sectors of economy. Muslims automatically go up as well. So, what I like about the report is instead of simply naming and targeting Muslims as Muslims, it suggests many overlapping approaches, all of which have the cumulative effect of alleviating or at least to some extent reducing the disadvantage and discrimination Muslims suffer from. So it has answered a question, at least gives a framework to answer a question. that I've been struggling with for the last 20 years.
Right. So, in fact, 20 years ago was when the Manmohan Singh government formed the Sachar committee, I believe, to study the social, economic, and educational condition of Muslims. And now the report, I believe, laid out what this is based on, what the latest report is based on, that there does need to be affirmative action. But again, can you take us back to that report and explain exactly why it was so significant at that time? And why it remains significant today, in fact?
Sachar Committee, for those viewers, readers who may not know, is a committee constituted by Prime Minister of India in 2005 after the victory of UPA government, headed by a former Chief Justice of Delhi High Court, Yogendra Sachar, a great soul, one of our best jurists, and a person who sort of was really ahead, in human rights movement and so on. So this was a committee headed by Rajendra Sachar Commission, which was tasked to inquire into the conditions of Muslim community and come up with recommendations. Such a committee report is a historic document, not because it said something which no one knew. In fact, when the report came, those of us who've been doing some bit of social science, who've been looking at communities and so on, we were not surprised. The important thing is that this was the first time Indian state, Indian government recognize that Muslims suffer from systematic disadvantage, deprivation, and discrimination. This is a major, that's what makes such a committee into such a historic document. It's an official, till then Muslims would talk about it. Look, what's happening to our community. But it was a sort of, they would feel awkward in raising this. It was kind of, as if I'm being very, it's like a woman talking about women's discrimination, say 50 years ago, when you felt very awkward in talking about this, as if you're doing something very personal. Such a committee made it possible for Muslims to say what they knew was the case. It made it possible for Indian state to officially recognize that the condition of Indian Muslims, that Muslims are not merely a minority. There are kinds and kinds of minorities. Parsis are a minority, Jains are a minority, Buddhists, Sikhs are, and Christians are. But the four communities that I mentioned are not educationally or economically more disadvantaged than Hindus. They are minorities and they do suffer in some ways as a minority. But they do not suffer from educational and social, educational, and economic disadvantage. So for Muslims, it's been a double win. A religious minority plus a disadvantaged social group. Such a committee put out official data on all these things. It put data on educational conditions, on economic condition, gave detailed information in a fairly balanced way, did not get into the more ridiculous kind of conspiracy theories that people used to get into, and made some very measured recommendations. Please remember, such a committee did not recommend reservation for Muslims, although there was a lot of clamor for that at that time. But Justice Rajendra Sachar, very balanced, very systematic, did not say. But he came up with a series of recommendations, many of which today have become part of our system, have been implemented. So it's not that such a committee was not taken seriously, except that the historic, the systematic disadvantage, deprivation, and discrimination that they were speaking about would have taken about 20, 30 years of sustained effort on the part of the state. Such a committee recommendations come in 2007. And within 7 years, we have a government whose agenda is to do anti-Muslim politics.
Right.
So what do you expect? That's the problem.
So now, this may be beyond the remit of the these two reports that we are talking about. But there is also, again, it is known that perhaps Muslim representation within politics is also a question of concern. And we know that these identities are all entangled. We know politics, political identity, economic identity, social identity. So how how do we differentiate between these two kinds of backwardness? Like, is there even a real difference? Is there any way to address one without addressing the other? I would like to know your thoughts on that.
It's a very important question, Pooja, and the Sachar committee did address this. They looked at it. They looked at the data, although they did not. Once again, as I said, they did not quite agree with some of the more extreme views. For example, there has been a very common view among Muslims that wherever you have concentration of Muslims, the constituencies are deliberately turned into reserved SC or reserved ST. Such a committee examined it, did not find that this was a correct assumption. So, as I said, very fairly balanced. But they look at the question, and this is a very important question. It's an important question because while in the case of, for example, Sikhs are a minority, but their share in our country's parliament or in the, say, assemblies of Punjab or Haryana would be about the same as their share in population. Which is partly also due to the fact that Sikh population is so concentrated in Punjab and some other areas. But they do have representation. The difficulty, the real issue with Muslim representation is this, that almost nowhere is the Muslim representation in assemblies, state assemblies. I can't think of a single state where Muslim representation in state assemblies is even half of their share of population. If you forget states like Jammu and Kashmir,
Yeah,
where
of
they're
course, of course, yeah,
largely
yeah.
concentrated. But in most states, so if their share in population is 20%, their share in assembly could be 6%, 7%, or something of that kind, everywhere. So, and you see, this is how politics works. If you have less than 10% Muslims in a constituency, political parties would say, यहाँ तो मुसलमान है ही नहीं, मुसलमान को टिकट कैसे दे सकते हैं? You know, if there are say 10 to 30% Muslims, there is some chance that in some cases you would get the ticket. If there are more than 30%, then of course Muslims will get ticket. There would be more than one Muslim candidate. There would be fragmentation and there would be counter mobilization. And all those Muslim candidates would be defeated. So the net outcome is that the percentage of Muslim representation in our parliament has been very systematically low. This is something that needs to be addressed. But here again, there are 2 or 3 issues. One is the simple, how the number of Muslims that make it to the state assembly or parliament. The second question is also how much of their voice get heard. These are slightly different things because you can have a non-Muslim who can raise the issues of the Muslims. So the earlier, the consolation used to be, all right, we don't have these many Muslims in assembly, but we have these many non-Muslims who are dependent on our vote and would therefore articulate some of our issues. So, and then if you remember, throughout post-independence India, the heroes of Indian Muslims were never Muslims. Just think of it. Who were the heroes of Indian Muslims? Jawaharlal Nehru, at some point Indira Gandhi, VP Singh, Arjun Singh, currently in some ways people like Rahul Gandhi. So actually Muslim communities have raised their voices through non-Muslim voices, non-Muslim representation. The trouble today is, again, it's a double whammy. A, you don't have Muslims. Number 2, no one dare raise Muslim issues. If you look at what happened to Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, so here you have a riot in the city, a party who the Muslims had massively trusted dare not speak about it, because then the fear is, okay, so, and this is what, in a sense, BJP's domination has done to the country, that it has silenced even the voices that came from non-Muslims. And that is what hurts, so in a sense, that's a double exclusion. Right. And it is in that vacuum, in that situation of double exclusion, that leaders like Owaisi walk in. It suits them perfect because then they can come and articulate, say things that no one wants to say, and present themselves as the leader. So that's the real challenge. It's a challenge that cannot be addressed by affirmative action, cannot be addressed by reservations. It's a political challenge. It's a challenge of democratic politics, and it's a challenge of creative coalition making, which is so currently the situation. I wrote about that in some other article a few months ago in Indian Express. The tragedy of the Indian Muslim is similar to the tragedy of the American black, which is that Republicans won't do anything for the blacks because they know blacks don't vote for us. Democrats wouldn't do anything for the blacks because they know blacks have no option but to vote for us. That's the problem. So we have a similar situation is happening with the Muslims. And this really needs a serious response from the democratic system. And to my mind, coalition making is the only way forward. More creative, interesting coalition making, where Muslims do not express themselves as one single unified community called Muslims. Muslims become part of the coalition of the bottom half of the pyramid.
Right. So there's also this argument amongst Muslims that all this talk about, yes, there are backward Muslims, there are untouchables amongst Muslims, etc. This is all right-wing propaganda to sow divisions because the scriptures don't have castes. Like there is no such concept in the scripture. So how does one respond to this argument?
Well, one way of responding to this argument would be to step outside one's house, go to a Muslim colony, speak to ordinary Muslims. I mean, this is similar to RSS argument. I mean, RSS say there are no division among Hindus. This is all sort of created. That's simply not true. And for that, you don't have to go by simply tendentious newspaper articles. Actually, there has been a great deal of scholarship that began with a path-breaking work by a sociologist called Imtiaz Ahmad, who's no more, one of our teachers, who wrote on Muslim stratification. Now, so all he did was that something that everyone knows. So it's not that every Muslim, I mean, in theory, of course, any Muslim can marry any Muslim. But in reality, that doesn't happen. There are biradaris. So in a sense, the entire Hindu social stratification has been mirrored among the Muslims. So you have biradaris, you marry within biradari. And if you try to marry across biradari, they are the same kind of tensions that you have in the intercaste marriage of Hindus. And the condition of different communities is very, very different. I mean, for that, you don't need to settle all these things in a television debate or in a street brawl. There are serious evidence available. Just look at the caste survey done in Bihar, which was done 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And incidentally, caste survey is not merely a survey of Hindu caste. Caste survey is a survey of caste across religions. And different Muslim caste biradaris were surveyed exactly as Hindu biradaris were surveyed in the Bihar survey. Now, if you look at Muslims, different Muslim communities in Bihar, you immediately see that at least 3 of those communities are at the same educational and economic level as that of upper caste. In the case of Bihar, Rajput, Bhumihar, and Brahmins. So there are Muslim communities in Bihar which are somewhat closer to them in their educational attainment. And then there are, of course, predominant Muslim communities, predominant in terms of numbers, who are either at the level of OBC or at the level of EBC, and some of them at the level of Dalits. And if you look at the all India picture, Muslims as a whole are comparable to the OBCs when it comes to their economic condition, and they are comparable to SC when it comes to their educational picture. If you look at the forward and backward Muslims, the word pasmanda is a word that's now becoming increasingly acceptable. The word was coined by Ali Anwar in a famous book about 20 years ago. which began to talk about the fact of Muslim communities which are backward and the serious divisions that exist within the community. Now, that's a simple fact.
Yeah.
By taking a very pristine, pure, religious, scriptural position, you cannot deny the fact that on the ground, just as among the Hindus, similarly among Muslims, there are serious divisions. And yes, when it comes to certain kind of religious discrimination of the kind that we have seen in the last 10 years, every Muslim is treated alike, treated badly. But when it comes to educational and economic opportunity, there are very serious differences that you cannot have a social policy that does not recognize it. Just as within the Hindu community, you have to recognize the fact of untouchability, the fact of backwardness, and so on. Similarly, among the Muslims, you have to address it. There's simply no other way. You cannot just overlook this huge reality. The issue of Pasmanda Muslims, namely backward Muslim communities, will occupy more and more of front stage in politics. And increasingly, I don't think political parties of all hues have any option except to acknowledge it, take it on board.
So one final question. You spoke about how, given the current political climate of it is not a good idea to talk about reservation. I mean, talk about reservation in general, there is a problem in the current political climate, but especially when it comes to Muslims. And you also end your article by suggesting that we must look at the way forward when it comes to affirmative action for Muslims. But this may not be the right time. And I believe the expression you use it, put it in a drawer for some time and look at it later. Is there a hint of pessimism here in with regard to how we can even proceed on this question?
Actually, no, it's optimism. It's optimism because I do believe that certain things should be kept in the drawer, because I do believe a time will come when there would be political space to addressing these issues, and times when you think, "Arey, ab kya hoga? Is waqt kaun sunega?" That's exactly the time for someone to sit down and draw a very careful blueprint, because when these things happen, they happen within 24 hours. So yes, currently it's a moment when someone would say, "What are you talking about?" In a situation where we're battling lynching, bulldozing, we're battling all kinds of things. You're thinking of affirmative action. Kya baat soch rahe ho? But that's exactly the moment when you need to think about it, and that's why I sort of congratulate the three authors, Hilal Ahmed, Sanjeer Alam, and Nazma Parveen, for thinking about something, because this is a blueprint. Yes, you may need to keep it in the drawer for some years, but one day when some political contingency would suddenly require you to think about it, well, there is some blueprint so that you don't end up taking actions, because much of Indian public policy suffers from lack of application of mind. And things happen in a zippy, things happen as a knee-jerk reaction. And mostly these policies end up not being very smart. So if someone has drawn up a smart policy, we should just be thankful about it and wait for a time when it may become politically relevant.
So on that optimistic note, sir, thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks to all our viewers who have been watching our videos. My name is Pooja Pillai. Please do like and subscribe our channel. We'll be here every week with a fresh episode for you with Yogendra ji. Thank you. See you again soon.
Thank you.